Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. We are on text number 56, chapter 2. I guess as far as an introduction or recap goes, we can note that, let's get that door all the way closed. Thanks. We can note that Arjun's just asked Krishna a question. The Gita follows a formula. Arjuna asks a question and Krishna gives an answer. And then that answer, you guys can figure it out. And then that answer gives rise to further questions. So that's the back and forth of the Gita. So when you're reading the book, if you go backwards, one verse or 7 verses or sometimes 27 verses, you'll eventually find a question. And the answer that you're reading is an answer to a specific question that was asked. That is the back and forth style of writing that was popular in what body of ancient Indian texts? That's right. That's the Upanishads. That's why the Gita is called the Gita-upanishad, because it follows this question and answer between guru and disciple that was the formula of the Upanishads. Now that doesn't mean that other Vedic texts don't sometimes borrow this schema, or that other world literature might not sometimes include conversations recorded within a text. But the Upanishads, this is their style. Guru and disciple meet, disciple asks questions, guru gives answers, gives rise to further questions, and the book proceeds like that. And the Gita is exactly the same text. The rest of the Mahabharata, the larger book that the Gita is a tiny little part of, does not follow that schema. It tells a story. So, sometimes Krishna runs in a particular direction, and his answers are only loosely related to the questions that were asked. Other times, Krishna's answers are direct responses to questions. In either case, there's value in remembering what Krishna's question is, because it helps to frame out, make sense out of, and helps you to interpret the answer and what Krishna is intending to convey in the answer. If somebody says lemonade, but then you don't know what the question is, you don't know what lemonade means. And then when you look back and you see the person said, "What would you like to drink?" and then the person says lemonade, then you know what the answer lemonade is intending to convey. So sometimes there's always value in knowing what the question was, but sometimes there's a lot of value. And usually the closer you are to the question, the more value there is. Usually that's how it works. If Krishna is going to tangent or broaden his answer or tackle topics that aren't directly related to the question. That usually happens later on down the road. Normally, when you look at answers, the closer you get to the question, the more directly related the answers are. Not always, but most of the time. Arjuna just asked his question 2 verses ago. And, Arjuna hasn't spoken since maybe verse 10, 9 of the 2nd chapter. So Krishna's been running for almost 50 verses. 45 verses. And Arjuna jumps in with a question. And his question is, what are the symptoms? What's the language? What are the movements? And how does he sit? The Stita Pragya Muni, the sage of steady wisdom. The Stita Dhi Muni, the sage of steady intelligence. The Samadhi Stasya Muni, the Muni who is situated in Samadhi. How does the Samadhi Stita Dhi, Stita Pragya Muni, what are his symptoms? How does he sit? How does he speak? And how does he move? That's Arjuna's question. Now the Stita Dhi Pragya or Samadhi Sta Muni is ostensibly, apparently, the term that Arjuna has chosen to refer to what Krishna has just prescribed, namely that you should act dutifully but without attachment. And the person who does act dutifully without attachment and can thereby achieve freedom from karma in this world, good and bad, Arjuna wants to know more about that person. Perhaps so he can recognize such a person, perhaps so he can try to become such a person. Those would tend to be the obvious reasons why this question naturally springs forth from Krishna's answer. You describe what you want me to do, and now I ask, well, tell me about the person who's done that so I can understand the road I need to follow, or how to check myself, or how to know what kind of progress I'm making, or who to find as a teacher or an inspiration. So, a boxing coach I follow named Barry Robinson, and he's got a theory that he propounds, which is the rhythm step theory. And he has hundreds of instances of boxers making a tell where they put their feet together right before they launch an attack, and knowing that a boxer is going to put his feet together right before he launches an attack. What would be called a power step in wrestling, but it's called a rhythm step in boxing. Gives you an advantage over your opponent because you can see before he acts. Usually in boxing, the faster opponent, the faster party wins, which makes it a game of youth. The larger the boxers get, the longer they can continue their boxing career because power, isn't as dependent on speed. But there's also the reaction time to how fast you can react to your opponent's movement. So even if the opponent is more fast than you, that doesn't mean they're going to beat you, because if you can see their telegraphed movement, you're then ahead because you can see what they're going to do before they do it. And even if you're slower, because you react more quickly, because you can tell it, you see their telegraph, you see the precursors to their movement, then it puts you in an advantage. So anyway, he shows boxers doing this rhythm step and getting knocked out all the time. But then sometimes people will come back to him and say, oh, but here's a world-class boxer who does the same thing that you're criticizing. Here, I have footage of a world-class boxer making this mistake. You follow? And then Barry Robinson will just be like, yeah, okay, so great. That doesn't mean I'm wrong. That just means even world-class boxers have lousy coaches who don't see the things I see, and therefore they're going to be at a disadvantage. And when the day comes when somebody is as fast as them and as skilled as them and knows what they're doing, then they're done. It doesn't disprove my theory just because somebody's making a terrible move, which I've spotted and I've demonstrated it and I've shown you evidence of it. Just the fact that somebody makes that terrible move and is still successful doesn't mean it's not a terrible move. You can see what they're doing. I can show you they're doing this, and then they launch their attack. As I can see it every time. So anybody who sees that is now one step ahead of that person. Did you guys follow that? That was a little long-winded, but did you guys follow the point? So it's interesting, but you know, a good theory and then practical examples, these things, they go hand in hand. If you just have the examples without the theory, then you can't check the example against the theory. Maybe that person's just really fast, or maybe they're just really strong, or maybe they have an iron jaw, or maybe they've been fighting tomato cans the whole time, which is a term for a subpar opponent. So if you just have the example of the boxer, you don't necessarily know that he has great boxing. He might just be grittier or faster or stronger or more tenacious or able to absorb more damage at this point in his life or his competition might be subpar. Just having the example without the theory is problematic, because your example might not be a good example, might not be a copyable example. You got to have theory, a well-codified, argued case for something. But if you just have the theory, you don't really know what it looks like in real life. Which is why YouTube changed the world. Now you can search anything you want to do. Replacing an exhaust system on a car, on a particular make and model of car, or how to spar in a boxing ring with 16-ounce gloves, or how do you know to execute a particular maneuver that you might encounter in a boxing ring. Or there's just a million different things. You can practically speaking search anything at this point. The world has changed so much since I was a teenager. Even since I was in my 20s, mid-20s. The last 25 years, it's just, the world just is so different. So this combination, a good sound theory written down on paper, spoken clearly, making logical points, explained step by step, combined with people following that theory and what they look like, that combination is brilliant. Nowadays, that example is a living example. You get a YouTube video and this is what the person looks like. Of course, if you're talking about a philosophy of life, it's not really possible to have a YouTube video on it, because it's how you interact with different situations in your life in real time in the real world. And so you might be able to stage some role playing that gives you an idea, but you're not really going to be able to understand what it consists of. And so although Krishna wasn't able to make use of YouTube videos, in his live conversation with Arjuna, he did the next best thing, and maybe considering the subject that was being discussed, he actually did the only way you can do it. You describe a theory, and then you explain what that theory looks like in practice. You describe theory and practice. And the more broad you want your practice teaching to be, the more abstract it is, the more symbolic it is, the more hypothetical it is, because you want to give somebody principles which they'll be able to use in a wide variety of circumstances. Let's just go ahead and give an example. I could say, active listening or reflective listening is a skill wherein you listen to someone and you paraphrase and reflect back to them what they've said to you. It's important that you don't merely repeat what they've said, but rather that you convey that you've understood the emotion that they were trying to convey. That's a definition of reflective listening. Then I might say, it might take you a few times because you might mislabel their emotion, or they might misexpress what they're actually feeling. It's also important to watch their mannerisms, what they do with their hands, what they don't say, their choice of language, their tone of voice, if their tone of voice matches up with the emotion of what they're saying. That second set of potential obstacles you might run into, or hurdles you may have to overcome in your forays of active listening, that's as valuable as the theory. Because somebody's anticipating what happens in the world, the main obstacles that you'll encounter. Now, there's no role-playing that's been done. It's all in some ways theoretical, but there's the basic theory, and then there's troubleshooting that theory with some real-life examples of things which might happen that you have to engage with. And in that way, you now have a leg up, and you have some tools to use, practical tools to use, in addition to the most abstract version of the theory which you've been given. Do you guys follow this? So Krishna, had a panic-stricken Arjuna. He gave him some lessons that you're not the body, that you are a soul, that you should be detached, that you should do your duty, you shouldn't be attached to the result of your duty, that these things will give rise to self-realization. He needs to stop. And then Arjuna says, well, what is this person that you're describing I should be? What are their practical symptoms? What's their speech? How do they move in this world? And how do they sit in this world? It's a fairly symbolic question, as Krishna's answers will reveal. Now we have a frame. We know what Arjuna's question was. And now when we hear Krishna's answer, we can then fit Krishna's answer into Arjuna's question. Just like we can take lemonade and fit it into the question of, what do you like to drink and what do you like to eat? And then we know, okay, he answered the question, what do you like to drink first? What do you like to eat? What do you like to drink? Lemonade. Okay, he answered the second question first. You know that because you can take lemonade and match it up to the preceding question, and you can understand what's being spoken about. And why would Arjuna ask such a question? I explained it to you. You want to see how to actually fix the car. What tools do I need? And for some things, a YouTube video is just brilliant. But if you're discussing how to cope with the pain of childbirth, watching someone do a guided breathing exercise would actually be the best way to understand the breathing pattern that's being described. Somebody literally does the breathing pattern in front of you in an accentuated way so you can see exactly how to time the breathing. The shortness of the length of breaths, through the nose, through the mouth, how many to take, how to cycle the breath, etc., etc. But now when you're saying, what does love look like? I don't know that a YouTube video with role playing is necessarily going to convey that. You might actually be better off reading Shakespeare. You might be better off reading a still fairly abstract and symbolic work, which nonetheless gives some further detail, some more practical points to consider, but is still, compared to a YouTube video, it's still very broad, very theoretical. But it does add something to the mere theory, devoid of any real-life examples or any further deliberations, just like I mentioned with the active listening exercise. Did you guys follow this? So depending on what it is you're asking about, sometimes you want a diagram, sometimes you want a YouTube video, sometimes you want role-playing, sometimes you want just some more principles to think about. And given that this was thousands of years ago, before the advent of streaming services and so on and so forth, this was the best Krishna could do in a real-life circumstance. I still genuinely think it's the best way to discuss philosophical issues. You discuss them in the most abstract, general terms, and then you start to hone in on some real-life examples that may still be quite symbolic, they may still be quite illustrative, they may still be somewhat metaphorical, but there's some further deliberation, even if it's not a full story of this person did this and that and the other thing. It might not be that much like a parable, which also has value, or an illustration, or a simile. It might still be a vague, symbolic, theoretical, further deliberation of principles, but it still nonetheless begins to give you more to sink your teeth into. For instance, you could say, jiu-jitsu is all about positioning, and you want to curb the movement of your opponent while increasing your ability to move. You want to gradually control your opponent to isolate either a limb or the neck, and then you want to eventually submit your opponent by putting them into some type of a lock, which will either result in them passing out if it's a strangle, or in breaking a bone if it's a joint. And so jiu-jitsu is therefore the art and science of control leading to submission. Did you follow this? So that is a very abstract description of grappling, and specifically submission grappling, where you're allowed to use joint locks and strangles, which you're not allowed to do in typical folk style or collegiate or Greco-Roman or Olympic wrestling. Because you're allowed to do joint lock, then therefore it's control leading to submission. Now you could explain to somebody that in this attempt to control someone, you should, as much as possible, try to use your legs in order to control their upper body. Because your legs are strong and their upper body is weak. And so the more you can put your legs on them in ways that control their upper body, you'll be able to use the power of your legs to control, let's say, their arm. And that puts them at a disadvantage, because it's very rare that you'll meet someone whose arm is stronger than your legs. It also gives a decided advantage to women, because women tend to be, within about 10%, as strong as men, pound for pound, in their lower body. Where women start to be a lot weaker than men is in their upper body, because they have breasts, which get in the way of their pec muscles and result in smaller pec muscles And you see this with women who squat, and if you look at their weight, and then you look at the weight they're able to squat, let's say at a high level, an Olympic level, it's not that different than how much men can squat. Like I said, maybe 10% less, maybe 20% at most. Whereas when you look at what women can bench press compared to what men can bench press who weigh the same weight, it's double. And so if you can control someone's upper body with your lower body, it is a great equalizer. And in general, if somebody is moving backwards, you want to assist them and push them backwards. And if they're moving forward, then you want to assist them by snapping their head down and pulling them forward, which will off-balance them. And you need to off-balance them, called kazushi in judo terminology, in order to then take advantage of them. You have to get somebody off balance, because if somebody's in balance, then they can counterattack. But if they're off balance, then you have an advantage. And so as much as possible, you want to get them to put their hands on the ground, because that off balances them and it puts them in a way worse position to attack you. I'm now giving you further things to think about, more than just a simple statement of control leading to a submission, but it's still highly theoretical and principled. It's not a specific technique. They're principles which could then result in hundreds or thousands of specific techniques that follow these principles. Krishna, in this section of the Gita, is doing something similar to that for Arjuna. So Arjuna asked Krishna 4 questions. What are the 4 questions, Howard? I'll say it for the 4th time today. What are the symptoms of a self-realized soul, generically? How does he speak, sit, and move? 4 questions. Arjuna's first answer is you give up all mundane desires, you don't react to those, you're satisfied in the self by the self. We're going to assume he was answering Arjuna's first question. We're going to assume he was answering Arjuna's first question. And now Krishna's second answer, the second verse of Krishna's answer. And again, we know what Arjuna's question is. One who is not disturbed in mind, even amidst the threefold miseries, or elated when there's happiness. Now that threefold miseries thing, it kind of throws you for a loop, right? What are the threefold miseries? Huh? The gunas, right? Wrong. What are the threefold miseries? Miseries caused by other people, miseries caused by natural events, and miseries caused by yourself. Adhyatmic, adidaivic, and adibautic. Or the way I said it, adibautic, adidaivic, and adhyatmic. Miseries that you cause for yourself, mental issues. Miseries caused by other people, someone stealing your car. Miseries caused by natural disasters, and earthquake. But what Krishna says is, Dukeshu anudvigna manaha. For the person whose mind is not agitated in miserable conditions. Sukeshu vigata spriha. For the person, these are all bahuvrihi samasas, for the person who's not elated, whose elation is gone in happy times. So we got 2 things. And this is a very standard way things are described in Sanskrit literature. You get a pro and a con, a positive and a negative. So when good things happen, you don't get elated and lose your head. When things are rough, you don't get super agitated. Okay? Vita raga bhaya krodha stita di muni uchate. The one for whom anger, fear, attachment have departed, that one is the stita di muni. He's called a stita di muni. So we got 3 things, which could also be 5 things. You should not get elated when good things happen. You should not get disturbed when bad things happen. You should give up anger, attachment, and fear. That's 5 things. Or it's 3 things because it's 3 compounds. For the person who doesn't get agitated in bad times. For the person who doesn't get elated in good times. For the person who's given up anger, fear, and attachment. So it's 3 things. Now that's a description of the person who's achieved it, but it's also a lesson for us, and we can start to work on stuff. Let's say you are okay with fear, but you struggle with anger. Let's say you are, you're okay about not getting too disturbed when things go south, but you do tend to get a little too elated when things go good, and you don't recognize that that means you're going to get bummed when things go south because you got attached to the things getting good. Maybe you didn't realize that anger came from fear. So you conquer anger and then it reveals fear. Now you can deal with fear. Maybe you didn't realize that fear came from attachment. You get attached to something and you're afraid of losing it, and you become angry when you contemplate that fear or when it actually gets lost. You don't notice the connection between attachment, fear, and anger. You don't notice the relationship between getting elated in good times and then suffering when bad times happen. This verse is just chock full of really valuable stuff that you can use in your own life on a daily basis. It's kind of like dialectic behavioral therapy. It could be Buddhist. It's not even based on believing in God. It's just a good way to live, to not get ripped apart by the ups and downs of life. Now you got a precursor. You got this idea of finding satisfaction in the self, by the self. So you've been given in the previous verse something kind of spiritual to meditate on. But this is pretty simple. It's got incredible value for us, and it also tells us how to look at somebody and see how they're moving. It tells you what to look for in a teacher. It's not just the raw theory of do your duty but don't be attached. It gives you a little more. Well, when you say don't be attached to the fruits, what does that mean? That means when good things happen, don't get too happy. Has Krishna said that thus far? Huh? No, he hasn't. Where has he said that?
Where he says, do your duty without jaya, whether you're in victory or defeat.
Oh yeah, he does say that. Yeah. Samatvam yoga. Siddhiya siddhyo samobhava samatvam yoga uchate. No, he doesn't say it there. Let's see, he says, maybe it's text 38. Let's see here. Sukha dukkhe same kritva. Being the same in happiness or distress. There you go. It's still not the same. I'm still making my claim. Where does Krishna say don't get elated when things go good? He hasn't said that yet. He said be the same in happiness and distress. What does that mean? That could mean don't behave differently. That could mean don't have a physical reaction to it. But when you say to somebody, be the same in happiness and distress, that's a very generic statement. When you say to somebody, don't get too excited when good things happen. Don't get too elated when good things happen. and don't get too agitated when bad things happen. That is a more fleshed out, more specific, more detailed explanation of what we're talking about that goes beyond the general theory which has been introduced. Therefore, I'm just going to double down on this. Has Krishna said thus far in the Gita, don't get elated when good things happen? He has not. Therefore, this is new information. Will Krishna continue to make this point, not to get elated when good things happen throughout the Gita? He will. He says it many more times. Sometimes he says just nirdvandva, be free from duality. Sometimes he gives you a little more, be the same in happiness and distress. But this is more detail. Don't get elated. Don't get excited when good things happen. Could somebody say, when Krishna said, be the same in happiness or distress, I thought he meant, don't freak out and do something terrible. But how am I supposed to just not get excited or be like joyful in my heart? Krishna could not have possibly meant that I shouldn't feel joy and excitement in my heart when something good happens. Could somebody reasonably make that rebuttal if they hadn't read this verse? If you say, no, Krishna said, be the same in happiness and distress, he means don't get elated when something good happens, when you get a promotion. Don't get elated. Could somebody then challenge you? He didn't say that. He says, be the same. Be the same means don't change your movements. But in my heart, I can feel some elation. Could somebody legitimately make that rebuttal? Can they make it now? Therefore, the conversation is moving forward. I, by the way, forgot this. Sukhe dukhe same kritva. I forgot that verse. And so I was guessing. I was taking a shot. But now that we've workshopped it, I'm doubling down. I'm saying this is correct. Krishna is giving us further information. This supports the analysis I've been offering thus far of what's happening in these verses. It's still theoretical. It's not a YouTube video, but it's the same principle. It's taking something more theoretical and making it more practical. Is this something you could take home and work on right now? How about the idea of be the same in happiness and distress? Is that immediately practicable? Could somebody go, I have no idea what you're saying?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. But if you go, what I'm saying, bro, is when good things happen, don't get all elated. Just stay zen. And when bad things happen, don't get all agitated. That's what I mean when I say be the same. And somebody goes, oh, okay, I got it. Wow, that seems really hard. More difficult than controlling the wind. And I can say, yeah, but with suitable practice, you can get better at it. That happens in the 6th chapter. So you can see how a conversation could proceed, and there's less doubt, less generic doubts. There's more certainty of what's being communicated. Doesn't mean it's easy to do, but it's a heck of a lot easier than if you're just given a simple, terse, aphorism-like statement. Same in happiness and distress. That's a little too terse. This gives you something more. This is a philosophical YouTube video. It's more details that you could practice. And amazingly, it's describing the person, but it's chock full of lessons for us. Like, had you guys ever thought that attachment leads to fear of loss, leads to anger? If you watch Star Wars, you probably remember that. Right? I think Yoda actually says that. Attachment leads to fear, fear leads to anger. I think that literally, that is a statement in The Empire Strikes Back, if I'm not mistaken. 1980, I believe, 81, I think it was 80. I believe The Empire Strikes Back. And then when Luke is in the swamp, and he's stranded on the planet, wherever that planet was, he's in the swamp, I believe this actual conversation took place. Could have been somewhere else. I might have gotten it wrong. I'm not a super mega Star Wars nerd like Madhuri, But I seem to recall attachment leads to fear. Fear leads to anger, huh? Okay. So this is incredibly valuable information. Incredibly valuable information. And this is kind of, what are your symptoms in your mind, right? It's like a mental level. In the material world, one who's unaffected by whatever good or evil he may obtain, neither praising it nor despising it, that person is firmly fixed in perfect knowledge. Tasya pragya pratishtita. He is a pragya pratishtita, a person in whom wisdom is fixed. Who? Ya sarvata anabhi sneha. Anabhi sneha. Who is not super affectionate. Tat tat prapya shubha. Who is not affectionate when this or that happens in life and he achieves something good or auspicious. He doesn't have too much attraction. Actually, this is more of a generic statement. The person is, in general, a little detached. They're not super affectionate towards this world. And therefore, tat tat prapya, shubha ashubham, when they achieve good or bad things in this world, na abhinandati, na dveshti. They don't praise them, they don't despise them. Abhinandati means they don't rejoice in them. Na dveshti, they don't hate them. Prabhupada's translation of they don't praise them or despise them indicates a verbal response. I don't really necessarily see that in the Sanskrit. Nand and dvish, abhinandati, na dveshti. They don't hate them, they don't rejoice in them. But if you do give a little spin on it and say, they don't praise or blame, which one of the questions is being answered? How does he speak? The first one could be, how does he speak with his mind? The second one could be, how does he speak with his words? If that was the case, what would the next verse be? How does he speak with his body? You follow? One who is able to withdraw his senses from sense objects, as the tortoise draws its limbs in the shell, is firmly fixed. That's how does he sit. How does he sit? With his senses not engaged in sense objects, able to pull back your senses from your sense objects. Now, let's just take an obvious, what's a standard sense object? What's just a regular old garden variety sense object that you engage with, everybody engages with on a daily basis? Food. If you regularly eat excessively, will you be able to resist eating whenever you want to? You will not. You'll get addicted. Get all sorts of problems. It becomes harder. So the person who's able to sit has to be careful how they eat. Not to get too indulgent. There's some stuff you shouldn't be touching. Some stuff you got to back off from. Chanakya Pandit, who Prabhupada liked to quote, Chanakya, he said you should view all women other than your wife as your mother. Your lust is just on one person, not two, not 10. Every woman except your wife is your mother. That kind of narrows the playing field down substantially. So you're not all over the place. You be careful with your eating. Careful with your romance. You're somewhat restricted. It's like in jiu-jitsu, you never want to give a limb. If you watch jiu-jitsu fighters wrestling, they're like this all the time. They're like, everything's tight to their body because they don't want to extend. If you extend, that gets really dangerous really fast. Because the guy throws his body on your arm. His whole body gets on your arm, and now your arm is extended, and his hips are work like against your elbow, and he's pulling with his whole body against your elbow. And so it's like entire hip complex. His entire posterior chain is now focused because he threw his whole body on your arm, and now he's extending you. You got no hope. You get it. Not given much. As a tortoise withdraws its limbs, so we should also withdraw our senses from sense objects. When it's safe, you reach out, okay, eat something. But then when it's not safe, okay, you go back in your shell. Chill. I can reach out and get something to eat when it's appropriate, when there's no predators around, when I'm not in danger. But then when there's a problem, I can just go ahead and pull my limbs back in my shell. That's how do you sit. Mind, body, words. If your mind isn't agitated, right? If your words don't convey that agitation, and if you physically don't become agitated and make crazy, dangerous moves, those are your symptoms. That's how you speak, and that's how you sit. Does that make sense? Additionally, let's not even give the praising and blaming with your words. Let's say it because it's not necessarily there in these verbs. Fair enough. Then you don't react. If you're rejoicing is a reaction. Hating is a reaction. It's more than just being agitated in your mind. It's another level. So there could be an intensifying level. You are doing battle in your mind to not become too agitated or elated. But if you do become too agitated, then what we do, you'll start to hate something. It's a further manifestation of it. If you do become too elated, then what will happen? You'll start to really rejoice and enjoy something. And so whether you see this as something you do with your voice, or you see it as just a further manifestation of you reacting to the world. It's like, how does he react? How does he speak? How does he engage with the world? So you could take it either way. You could take these words to mean he's actually praising and blaming, and it fits really nicely. Or when you hate something, you talk about it. When you're rejoicing in something, you talk about it. Or you could say that it's a further reaction that will involve some physical movement. It's behavioral on some level, even if it's covert. It's not the smallest incipient phase of just getting agitated or elated. It's rather a subsequent phase when you start to then manifest that elation as rejoicing, or you start to manifest that agitation as hatred. And so this could also be seen as a continuum where you don't do, catch yourself here, and if you don't catch yourself here, catch yourself here. And if you don't catch yourself here, then catch yourself at least where the senses aren't moving. And what happens between your mind and your body? Your words. We don't normally notice this. We talk about body and mind, but your words are right in between body and mind. Your words are kind of like your body and kind of like your mind. They're sort of a halfway point in between body and mind that normally doesn't get addressed. How much your speech affects your mind, how much your speech affects your activities. I remember I was a young devotee, and we were out at some preaching program, and we drove back home from the program, some hours, and somehow we drove through the red light district. And so, I was driving, all of a sudden you see prostitutes on the other side of the street, dressed in provocative clothing. So I just, kind of put my head down and chanted japa and just didn't look out the window for a few blocks. Then we got back to the temple, and there was a devotee who'd gone with us on the program, and it was a second generation devotee, a person who was born in the movement. He came along, I think, to play mridanga, or was a driver, I can't remember what he was doing. But he was like, oh, that was like we drove through that red light district. And I was like, yeah, whew, yeah, it was kind of rough. He's like, yeah. He's like, we should go back there. Like as a joke. I was like, yeah, haha. He's like, yeah, haha. Yeah, we should just get in the car and go back there. And I said, yeah, I'm going to sleep, bro. I'll see you tomorrow. I'm out. Adios. You follow? So, I don't know, maybe I can not put this online now, but I had this experience. I was traveling around where this devotee just, brought this up to me in a joking way. I don't know, maybe he wasn't joking. I didn't chastise him, but I just got out of there. I felt super uncomfortable, and I just got the creeps, and I just bailed out. But I think most of the time when people are contemplating doing something wrong, they talk about it, and they try to get other people involved. There's certain stuff that people do without talking about it. There are sinful habits or addictions that people have which are very private and which they don't share with the world. But a lot of times, misery loves company, with alcohol, with drugs, in this case with sex, potentially. Like I said, I never stuck around to talk to this dude and ask him what was going on in his head. And he left the movement. So we got to be careful about our speech. We got to curate our speech. We got to catch those reactions. We either catch it right in the beginning, just an agitation, elation, or we catch it a little further along when it becomes hating or rejoicing. And at least we catch it before our limbs start, grasping at things they shouldn't be grasping at. Do you see this continuum? Super clean, isn't it? And now you get to match it up. All right, well, the first one is the symptoms. The second one is, how does he speak? The third one is, how does he sit? Right? Or maybe the third one could be, how does he move? He moves like a tortoise. Could be how he sits and how he moves. The third one could be both, how he sits and how he moves. The second one could be how he speaks, or we could interpret speech as more metaphorically, how does he react to the world? Which usually is first, oftentimes, first conveyed by speech. You talk about something, you talk it up, and then you eventually do it. Mind, body, and words, symptoms, speech, and sitting. You see how knowing Krishna's question then allows you to understand, knowing Arjuna's question allows you to understand Krishna's answer. And it's quite symbolic, it's quite abstract, it's quite theoretical, it's quite hypothetical, but it's definitely got more teeth to it than what he said thus far. And it gives you some practical hints that you can use in your life. Like if you're talking about something, it's gone too far. And if you're extending yourself, it's gone way too far. But you're going to have to move in the world on some level. Right? You're going to have to move on some level through the world. So like the tortoise, you engage appropriately when it's safe. You get married. That's safe. Safer. Eat prasadam. Have a regulated diet. Generally, devotees don't go to clubs. It's just a bad environment. It's not a very enjoyable environment for someone who's somewhat self-controlled. There's a limit. And that limit may be different depending on where you're at in your life. But this, having some standard you live by, having some integrity, this is what it means to be self-realized. You can start practicing it today. Certain stuff. We all know what we shouldn't be doing. Like, just imagine for a moment that there were no witnesses, and you and Krishna, and your thoughts and deeds, your current state of consciousness as conveyed by your thoughts and your deeds, were all out on a table in front of you and Krishna. And you were looking at the quality of your thoughts and your deeds. And Krishna was there, and you were there, you're a devotee. And he's looking at your thoughts and your deeds all laid out on a table in front of you. How tough would it be to be like, oh, that one's got to go, and that one's got to go, and oh, that's no good. How tough would it be to do that exercise? It's kind of like if you took everything out of your refrigerator, put it all out on the table. It's like, oh, that's rotten. That's not rotten, but it's going to be rotten tomorrow. So just going to just throw that out, Oh, that's like all messy. We got to clean that up. Transfer that into a better container. That's gross. Get rid of that right away. Isn't it? And so this kind of stuff combined with sincerity and honesty, it gives you it's powerful. The last verse. Though the embodied soul may be restricted from sense enjoyment, the taste for sense objects remains. So if you pull your limbs back, that doesn't get rid of your desire to do the bad thing. Like putting on a straitjacket. But if you cease those engagements because you've experienced a higher taste, then you're fixed in consciousness. So it's not just restricting yourself, but it's restricting yourself because you found something higher. Then you're not in danger anymore. Then you're like that tortoise. You're safe. You're able to move. It's not artificial. You see how Krishna's troubleshooting. It's very powerful. It's very meditative. It's very useful. It's incredible principles. They have applicability in your life. He's troubleshooting it. He's working through it with you. And even though it's symbolic, even though it's theoretical, even though it's still somewhat metaphorical, even though it's still very hypothetical, it's powerful. It has value. Thank you, IGTV. So yeah.